if just through visiting a farm, you start to care more, to us, there's all of these ripple effects. Because just like, I'm looking at how impacted I was by just watching a show on Chef's Table that led to me pursuing an entire career and starting a business. Like, I don't think we should ever underestimate how a deeply impactful experience can have major ripple effects. And so every guest that comes to one of these properties and farms, I get excited about, because whether it's a decision that they make at a grocery store, whether it's a career path they go on, whether it's conversations they have with friends, whether it's how they're investing their money, all of those impacts are very possible when people more deeply can connect with and understand what's actually happening on these landscapes. And so the simple act of visiting a farm, I think, can have this massive impact.
Welcome to the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast, a show about human environments and how they can be used as a force for good. Conversations that educate and inspire people looking for a different way to do real estate. I'm Neil Collins, and on the show today we have David Rust, founder of a new company called Sagra that partners with sustainable agriculture farmers to provide visitors with unique experiences that showcase the flavors, sights, and philosophies of the farm. About 10 years ago, I remember watching a TED Talk called How I Fell in Love with a Fish by a chef named Dan Barber. In his presentation, Dan talked about the vitality and flavor that he was finding in ingredients that were sourced from healthy ecosystems. This video went on to be shared by millions of people, and it planted a seed within them about where our food comes from and how people can be stewards to create rich ecosystems and farmlands. That video certainly stayed with me, as it did with our guest today, David Rust. David's background is interesting because it showcases a big shift that I'm seeing within the real estate and agriculture industries. You see, David comes from a software and tech background, but always had a deep down passion for sustainability and agriculture. His company Sagra represents the innovative edge that's taking place, where entrepreneurs are creating businesses that seek to connect people to the land, the farms, and the farmers themselves. Sagra is a hospitality management company that partners with farmers to provide guests with unique and tailored experiences that ultimately highlights the terroir of the farm and the place. This, he believes, can add revenue streams for farmers and enable them to do what they do best. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another podcast episode of the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast. I'm excited, as always. We've got a really great guest coming on today in an area and a company that I'm genuinely interested in learning more about. We have David Rust, the founder and CEO of Sagra. David, welcome to the show, and thanks for taking the time to join me.
Yeah, thank you for the invite. I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, David, I mean, for those that have been tuning into the podcast, they know that we're really trying to bridge together this concept of agriculture and real estate, which is the industry that you're really in, of regenerative tourism and supporting regenerative agriculture. And we're going to get there. Spoiler alert for everybody. But you've got a really interesting background, especially in the startup space. But going back even before kind of that professional entry into the world, where did you grow up and what was life like from an early age?
Yeah. Well, I grew up about 45 minutes south of San Francisco in a town called Menlo Park. And, as a kid, I was exposed to farms and agriculture in a number of settings. I think first and foremost, my dad was born and raised on a farm in Germany and moved to the States in his mid-30s. And as a result, when we would go visit grandparents and family, it was pretty much always to go stay on a farm. And specifically, the farm that we would go visit where my dad grew up was sort of this classic European courtyard style building where you would have animals that were living on the first floor, and you would have sort of 3 generations of family living there together. And then the field sort of went out from the building. And on my dad's side of the family, we also had cousins who ran what's called an agrotourism, so a farm in Italy, in Umbria, that also allowed people to visit and stay on site. So, when we would go visit family, we then oftentimes go visit other family on this other farm. And as a result, I just fell in love with those places. And fortunately, growing up in California, there were also a lot of nearby farms where you could go and visit, as a kid. I also went to a school from 1st through 8th grade that really prioritized sort of the outdoors. And so we had small farm garden on the school campus, and, they prioritized things like woodworking and pottery. And so all of those very tactile experiences as a kid with the outdoors, with nature, and specifically with food really had an impact. And, my mom would always take me to the farmer's market, and she would always take me specifically to the guy who was growing lettuce, because he was the dad of this famous chef. Her name's Jessie Cool, who, probably know more of Alice Waters and Chez Panisse and chefs like that. Jessie Cool is very much so a like-minded and like-hearted person in the San Francisco Bay Area who cooks fresh from the farm. Her dad was a farmer, sold lettuce at the farmer's market. That was my favorite place to go on the weekends. And so just all of those experiences, plus growing food, in this little garden next to our family home, was also one of my favorite topics. We would go, to the plant nursery and get to pick out cucumbers and pick out peppers. And I loved all of that. So it was a big part of childhood for me.
So help bridge the gap. Like you have this really foundational upbringing. I'm curious, what kind of education did you grow up in that 1st through 8th grade that was so tactile and nature-based?
Yeah, it was, it didn't strictly follow Montessori or one of those other methodologies, but it was very much so aligned with that. We weren't given any homework. So I didn't have homework until high school. And it was each grade was 20 kids, and you pretty much were with those 20 kids for 8 years with some slight changes. And so it was really a focus on instilling a sense of curiosity and joy around learning. And that school, it's called Peninsula School, really, I think, nailed that. And so, you would have electives that you could take, and from, like pottery and woodworking, we did a lot of camping. I remember by the time we hit high school, we were so excited and eager about learning that we came in charging at a point when other kids had already been burned out by school. And it was a really interesting, transition and thing to see that people had very different experiences. And we definitely had a very privileged, schooling experience.
Yeah, the reason I highlighted that is just like we talk about our theories of change and how do we create change in the world. And more you realize, like, if we just back up and look at those formative years of how do we get more kids' hands in the dirt, and really building that self-confidence rather than just bringing them through this, I don't know, here's your 7 periods, you got a bell in between, and go. This is going to be your life for the next 12 years.
Right.
Anyways, I digress, but I also wanted to hone in on, like, you've got, it looked like you went to Stanford, and then you have this experience that is really in this business building world.
Right.
Help fill in this picture between what you're doing now, which is really centered around sustainable farming and hospitality with Sagra. But then you get this experience of, like, you're with Lyft and you're doing these other startups. I'm sure there's a lot of experience in there that's fueling your technical expertise of what you're doing now. But where did you think that you wanted to head? Like, how did you orient your compass as a young professional?
Yeah. Well, when I first got to college, like many people, I really didn't know what I wanted to do, but I was naturally drawn to, things connected to the environment. And so I ultimately ended up majoring in environmental science and environmental engineering. And so I did a lot of classes focused on solar, wind, hydro, a lot of sort of the renewable energy side. And I just was meeting a lot of other people in college who were interested in those topics. And so we ended up starting a really neat organization within Stanford called the Green Fund. And the idea was that there were all these kids who wanted to try out sustainability projects on campus, like solar hot water heating or composting or whatever it might be. And so we basically convinced the university to set aside a certain amount of money each year into a fund, and then students could submit project applications. And then we created basically a board of people from across the university, including students and teachers, who would then approve projects. And a bunch of really interesting things happened, like putting solar hot water heating on a dorm and a small wind turbine up in the hills and composting and all these different programs. And so I was always fishing around for things in that space that interested me. And I thought that I was going to go work in like the solar industry specifically at that time. And honestly, serendipity sort of came into effect, and I ended up getting into a program at school sort of junior year called the Mayfield Fellows Program. And the whole idea is they take folks who are really majoring typically in engineering degrees, but who are interested in sort of entrepreneurship and starting businesses. And it's this 9-month sort of work study program where you get to meet a bunch of other people who have founded companies. You get to almost do like a mini MBA. You're doing case studies around what it's like to start businesses. And so as a result, I kind of found myself in this world of startup companies and fell into, through a friend of mine through school. He had been working at a company called Zimride at the time, which became Lyft. And what Zimride was at that time was a long distance carpooling business. So if you wanted to drive from San Francisco to LA, you could list that you're driving there on Thursday and that you have 3 seats available in your car, and somebody could basically purchase a seat. And the whole idea was to increase occupancy in vehicles, take cars off the road. I got to know the team there really well through my friend. Then they launched Lyft. I was one of the first, 30 passengers on the platform because I just knew the team. And they started testing it in San Francisco, and it was working well. And at a certain point in time, I, through knowing the team and the founders, joined right when they were about to launch their second market, which was Los Angeles. And so I just found myself there and in a great place and a great time, and had this incredible sort of 4.5-year journey of helping them launch markets and helping to build an internal strategy team. And so it wasn't really an intentional aim of mine to go into transportation per se, or go into startups per se. It was just, I kept following things that were interesting to me. And then given that Lyft grew really quickly, it was a fascinating place to be and a wonderful place to learn.
Yeah, I think that's the piece where how do we take those skills that we're learning in maybe a more corporate environment, or certainly the meteoric rise of a company like Lyft, and then begin to apply them in different areas, especially if we're at the helm and we get to create an idea out of our head or out of our heart and pursue it. Why did you leave Lyft? What was the impetus?
Yeah. Well, it was at first sort of an unformed feeling of wanting to focus on something that where the actual space or industry or product that I was working on was something that I cared more deeply about. I really enjoyed being at Lyft. I made a lot of great friends. It was a great experience, but transportation wasn't necessarily a space that I cared a huge amount about. And so I started to ask myself those questions. And at the beginning, again, it was just a feeling. And I remember towards the end, I noticed how I was watching Chef's Table on Netflix and how excited I would get by those episodes. I would notice that I'd be reading books about farming and food. I noticed that I was listening to podcasts about farming and food. I noticed that I was spending my time, whenever I would have it, visiting farms. And so I just started to ask myself, what does that mean? And what would that look like? And eventually that sort of desire and that calling just kept getting louder. And I said, you know what, I think it's time to leave, but I need a chunk of time to explore it. And so when I did leave Lyft, the first thing I did was actually go to Germany, where my dad's from, and went back and visited that family farm. I went and I lived there for a number of months. I was learning the language. And I went and I visited places that all kind of revolved around that theme. A friend of mine runs a company in Kenya that helps small scale farmers there. I went and I spent time there. So I was just sort of following, as I call it, almost like the breadcrumbs of where does this interest lead? And at a certain point in time, I came back to the United States after this little stint off. And I, again, was watching Chef's Table religiously. I was consuming this content. And I said, okay, well, what's one thing I could do now to pursue this? And so I ended up sending a cold email to the Stone Barn Center. There's a restaurant there called Blue Hill. And Dan Barber, who's the head chef, was featured in the first season and I think the first episode of Chef's Table on Netflix, and got a response. And somebody said, hey, why don't you come by and visit? And this guy, Jason, will meet you. And so I go to the farm. It's north of Manhattan. It's this multi-100-acre farm that was originally owned by the Rockefellers and then was turned into a foundation. And they both do a bunch of educational programs. They train farm apprentices. They have a top restaurant on site. They have a whole active working farm. And I remember going there and meeting Jason, who then became a co-founder of Sagra. And we were walking through the fields and we were picking lettuces. And then all of a sudden we were in the kitchen and meeting the chefs. And I just felt like I had walked through the screen of watching the show into the reality of it. And it felt just like this total sense of homecoming. Like, oh, all of a sudden these memories of childhood and these deep experiences, like, were all just flooding back to me. And it was like a really embodied feeling of like, this is what I want to be involved in. That's where really the beginning of Sagra started, was just that sense of, oh, this is I want to be in.
That's amazing. It puts goosebumps on my arms, as I remember I was in the Peace Corps. I happened to watch, maybe it was a TED Talk by Dan Barber. He had two talks. There's like one about sustainable fish, and then another was about goose farm, of all things. And it was one of those like pivotal moments in my life of, there is something here. There's a feeling that this is life-giving. Like, this is such an interesting route that somebody is able to do this and to bring food together. And how funny that Dan Barber is like just one of those common elements. But let's talk about how an idea really comes together. I mean, I've heard you talk in other places about how in Germany or in Italy or in Costa Rica, agrotourism is a much bigger thing than it is in the United States. Like, how do you take that to where you realize we really don't have the same industry in the US? And then to begin to put an idea together where now you can actually put it out to the world and create a company behind it.
Right. I mean, the beginning was through being at that farm at Stone Barns. I was meeting a lot of farmers, and I would go visit a lot of these farms. And I was just in awe of not only how hard these people are working, but also just the intentionality that they're putting into understanding their landscapes and how to tend for the soil and how they're linked to climate change and how they can help sequester carbon or restore habitats. And so I would go to these spaces and just be fascinated and wonder why nobody else was able to go to these spots. And I would ask friends, and most of them had never set foot on a farm. I would ask folks why, and it ended up becoming kind of obvious, which is that I was having to spend actually quite a lot of time and effort getting in touch with farmers, finding a way to go visit, finding a time that worked for them, convincing people to take, precious time out of their day when they're busy farming to show me around. And it wasn't a surprise that other people weren't able to go have those experiences. And so the beginning of the idea really started forming just around visiting farms with just a desire to learn more. And then starting to think about, I first asked myself, do I want to be a farmer? And I was seriously considering just doing a hard right turn from the career I had before and going into a farmer apprenticeship program. And my sister actually did that. She's a farmer outside of Berlin. And when I evaluated that, I sort of realized that I was really interested in this space, but I didn't necessarily want to be a farmer myself, but I wanted to do something related to it. And the more I was visiting these places, the more I was realizing, like, actually exactly what I'm doing is what I would like to create, which is an ability for people to visit these spots. Like, for example, I went out to the Rodale Institute in Pennsylvania, which is the organization that really pioneered the early organic certification. They're doing a lot of the regenerative organic certification work now. And you would see these amazing test plots where they would have sort of conventionally farmed land right adjacent to regenerative farmland without tilling or spraying. And it was just night and day, like the vibrancy in the soil, the biodiversity that was alive. There were actually like plants and animals in the side that was farmed regeneratively. Everything was dead on the other side. And it just became clear that we need a way for more people to connect with these farms. So it wasn't that we came in saying, hey, agrotourism is happening in other parts of the world. How do we bring it here? It was actually really just connecting with farms and saying, how do we get people to these specific places? And as we dug into that, it became clear that one of the reasons that people aren't able to visit those farms today is that for the farmers themselves, they don't have the time or resources or expertise to host people, clean rooms, rent out rooms, cook food. So it became clear that, well, what if our role is in handling the quote unquote hospitality elements needed to bring people to a farm? And how can that also bring in extra income to support farms? Because a lot of farms recognize that type of hospitality revenue is an important income stream, but how do they actually tap into it? And so like any business, there was a starting point of how do we do this? And then a refinement over time of what really the business model is that can work for all sides.
Oh, that's interesting. And so do you target, I can think of a lot of complications with the business model of, are you targeting a specific area, a specific type of farm? It, like your website, very clearly at the very top, it talks about supporting sustainable farming. So what does that look like? How do you go then, like focusing, do you find the initial farm, or are you looking across the country? What's the playbook here?
Yeah. So for the first year, the way that we went about it was just first and foremost prioritizing meeting really inspiring farmers and then saying, how could we bring people to these farms? And, as you know, from being in the real estate world, the tricky thing is the way a lot of zoning codes are written is that it's very difficult to actually create things like lodging on agriculturally zoned land. And so the first hurdle we came up against was, okay, well, what do you do with that? I mean, you can find a really inspiring farm. You can find a really inspiring farmer. It can be in a great place. It's accessible and drivable, but can you even get the permits to add lodging on site? And it varies by county. So it's incredibly complicated. It's incredibly time consuming and cost intensive to do it. And as Sagra, we didn't, own any of this land. And the farmer is not going to invest in building that out. So then we ended up finding ourselves in this sort of tricky situation of not sure how to bring that to life. And over time, what we really started to realize is that if you find locations that already have infrastructure and permits for hospitality, and then you can turn those destinations into centers for learning around sustainable agriculture. You can, partner with local farmers to put that land into agricultural use. That's a route that actually works. And so you're kind of taking maybe more of a traditional process of what folks in hospitality or real estate would look for, which is, okay, here's a place that already has guest rooms and already has a commercial kitchen and already has permits, but also it has all this agricultural land that either already is a farm or could be a farm. And how do we then put that into use? Just ends up being really the predominant way of being able to grow. And so that's where we really heavily started to focus and where sort of our entire attention is right now in making that work.
I see you've got a location in Vermont. Do you have one location so far, or what's that look like?
Yeah, so our first location was in California at an amazing, about 1,100 acre rotational grazing cattle ranch called Stemple Creek up in a place called Tamales Bay, north of San Francisco. And so we ran that as sort of an initial pilot location in partnership with the amazing family, the Poncha family, who runs that ranch. And so that was our first spot for an entire year. We had guests coming and staying there. We cooked meals, we led farm tours, activities, and it was a great place to really just test out how this whole model would work. And then we just opened in Vermont at this wonderful place called Hill Farm, totally different type of farm. It's a diversified vegetable farm. Nicole's the farmer there. Austin's the chef. We don't own that property either. It's owned by the Pollard family. They live, in the region, and then we run it and we operate it. So again, we're serving that role of running the hospitality, agritourism components that connect people to the farm. And that's the role we're serving there. And then we have a location coming up in the Catskills of New York as well.
How do you talk with farmers about this? I mean, is this an immediate win-win for them, or what's that look like from their perspective?
Yeah. So the way that we partner with farmers has been shifting over time, because in this current model where you're really looking for places where there's already some degree of existing infrastructure, the property owners in many of these cases are folks who maybe are really looking at it as a development opportunity or a real estate opportunity, but where they deeply care about how the land is tended, where they care about using this as an educational sort of mission aligned, place to bring guests and introduce them to sustainable agriculture. So in that world, typically there's a property owner, and then there's us as the operator who's running the experience, and then there's the farmer. And the way that we work with farmers in that way can be varied. It's on one hand, oftentimes there's local farms or farmers who want extra land to expand onto, and we can offer that through the property. And it has all these other upsides for them because we have an on-site restaurant, we have an on-site farm stand. So we become basically a guaranteed buyer for the farmer. So they know they're getting an income stream from us being there. And they get to basically showcase and share the mission of what they're doing through leading farm tours, activities. And then we make sure that a portion of every stay gets funneled into supporting the farmer and local farms as well. And, that's sort of at the core of the philosophy of what we're doing, is that there's income coming in now because people are paying to rent rooms, they're paying to eat, they're paying for activities and events. Maybe they're hosting a corporate retreat there, or a wedding as well. And that income never would have happened on a farm before. So now if you take a portion of that and you can funnel it in so that the farmer doesn't have to necessarily rely just on how many potatoes they sell or how many broccoli they sell to make a living, but there's an income stream that just supports them. It frees up, I think, people to be able to focus on expanding if they want. It allows people to focus on sharing the mission of what they're doing.
I want to take a quick break from this episode to tell you about our work at Latitude that supports this show. We work within the real estate industry, and let's be honest, real estate agents don't have the most sterling reputation as far as professions go. And there's good reason for that. It is the epitome of a transactional industry that shows little regard for how we inhabit the planet. And that's a shame, because real potential exists to help people create healthy, resilient, and beautiful homes and habitats when they are ending one chapter in their lives and dreaming into the next one. A time when people are making financing decisions involving hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars that have decades-long lasting implications. A time when physical structures are being inspected, updated, and transacted. At Latitude Regenerative Real Estate, we want to change this. We see the real estate sale as being the most potential time to begin the transformation that we all know is sorely needed for homes, buildings, and agricultural lands. We envision real estate professionals that do more than just open doors, but help people navigate financing, negotiations, zoning, and contractors in order to create environments that go to support both people and planet to thrive. As a public benefit company, we have a growing community of change agents located across the US that work with buyers, sellers, developers, and earth tenders. Reach out to us to tell us how we can help you with your real estate dreams and aspirations. You can visit our website at chooselatitude.com to see properties for sale, find value-aligned companies and organizations to help with your project, and get connected to a change agent near you. Where do you see this going, David? I mean, is you're now on two coasts. Hospitality, even in a city, is not the easiest business model
Right.
to lean into. Where do you want to grow, and how do you do that? I mean, farms are oftentimes in pretty rural locations. What do you see as strategic growth for Sagra?
Yeah, I mean, the way that we focus on it is that as soon as you get outside of urban cores, you find yourself in agricultural land very quickly. And it's not like you need to go way out there to find farmland. I mean, the Hudson Valley, the in and around San Francisco, Chicago, Atlanta, you name it, Nashville, there's so many places where within even 45 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, you're into full on agricultural territory. And so the way that we think about it first and foremost is how do we go sort of urban core by urban core and say, how do we open a location within a 2.5 hour drive that allows people in that region to have a direct experience of sustainable farming, learning about cover crops, learning about crop rotation, learning about soil health, learning about the link to climate change, learning about how hard the work is to farm, learning about who the farmers are, their own life stories, what got them into it. And, that's first and foremost how we think about it. And opening those hubs really outside of all major US cities is sort of goal number one. So in Vermont, for example, you can reach that pretty easily as a drive from Boston or from New York as the two major urban centers. But there's also plenty of people who live in the Hudson Valley or throughout Connecticut or Rhode Island and in Vermont itself and New Hampshire that can all access that. So it serves as this really incredible hub in the same way that Temple Creek Ranch in California, very easily reachable from San Francisco and the whole Bay Area. And so we're just going kind of region by region and opening sites.
Well, it's interesting that you're using that. I love this link between the urban and the rural, that like they're intricately linked and they need each other. And so often, I mean, we see this showing up politically that there's an urban rural divide and it's a political divide. And we don't really start to see the commonalities and the reciprocity between the two, which is why I really think that's a great way to go about it. And I mean, what better way to bring people together than through food?
Well, and it's interesting too, because if you go to a farmer's market, like I would oftentimes when I was living in New York, would go to the Union Square farmer's market. And there were all these farms that had basically driven in hours from the surrounding regions, from New Jersey, from the Hudson Valley, from elsewhere, Pennsylvania. And they were all collecting in these places that were very accessible for people. How do we reverse that and say, how can people from the city get to where those farmers came from and actually go to the farms themselves? Because at a farmer's market, maybe you get a couple minutes to quickly chat with a farmer and learn a little bit, but there's nothing like actually being on the farm. And so our hope is that not only are farmers coming in and able to, connect with the people buying food in the cities, but the guests can also go in the reverse direction.
You start to see more and more signs about regenerative tourism. And I've seen Sagra get lumped into this category. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah. Our mission is really about connecting people to farms. And hospitality is kind of just the lure to get people there, right? I mean, we ultimately want to get people to farms and help them learn about what's happening there. It's just easier to get somebody to a farm if they can book a room, if they can book a meal. It's hyper accessible. You don't even need to care about farming, come there. You can just take a vacation. But once you're there, whether it's the guidebook that you get when you check in that introduces you to the land, or the seed packet that you take home with you at the end of the stay, or the information that you read on the restaurant menu, you all of a sudden are going to get all of these ideas, coming to you in a really accessible way. And so I mentioned that because our focus really is on connecting people with farms and regenerative agriculture in particular, which is certain methodologies and practices that really care for the health of the soil, the health of the people who are tending the land, the ecosystems. And more there's conversations about this broader idea of regenerative tourism. I don't think about it a huge amount just because to me, it's almost such a broad category. I don't know how to hold it together. I know broadly speaking, you had sort of sustainability focused travel and tourism, which was how do you sort of maintain the status quo without degrading the places that you're visiting. Regenerative is about how do you actually enhance and improve the places that you're visiting. So I get the philosophy, but I think we're going to see over time that under this broad umbrella of regenerative tourism, regenerative travel, actually are a lot of different subcategories that are actually very large in their own degree. So I think travel focused on regenerative agriculture and sustainable farming is, as we talked about at the beginning, a huge industry in many other parts of the world. In Italy alone, there's 20,000 agrotourismos. You can go to Italy, you can go to Germany, France, Israel, Japan, South Africa, and in any of these places, it's incredibly easy to go stay on a farm. So I think that'll be a huge category in the industry in its own right in the United States over time. You'll have under regenerative travel and tourism places that are specifically focused on green buildings and zero waste and non-polluting environments and wastewater treatment in sustainable ways and gray water use. And so I think there'll be these subcategories that it can be helpful to bucket under regenerative tourism. But again, I think over time, each of those subcategories are kind of going to be talked about in their own regard.
Yeah, if you could answer the question, like, wouldn't it be cool if Sagra could ... that really like big, impactful pie in the sky or big vision that might not be showing up on your website, but is like a deep seed in there.
Yeah. To me, it's what if through Sagra and people being able to visit farms, not only would a much larger portion of the world be able to better appreciate and understand what it would mean to grow food in a more sustainable, regenerative way. And that means when they're at a grocery store, whether at a farmer's market, that they're making choices around buying food in a way that is supporting the fight against climate change and supporting, increasing biodiversity and moving away from spraying pesticides, chemicals, over-tilling of the land, depletion of the topsoil. If just through visiting a farm, you start to care more, to us, there's all of these ripple effects. Because just like, I'm looking at how impacted I was by just watching a show on Chef's Table that led to me pursuing an entire career and starting a business. Like, I don't think we should ever underestimate how a deeply impactful experience can have major ripple effects. And so every guest that comes to one of these properties and farms, I get excited about, because whether it's a decision that they make at a grocery store, whether it's a career path they go on, whether it's further learning that they plan to pursue, whether it's conversations they have with friends, whether it's how they're investing their money, all of those impacts are very possible when people more deeply can connect with and understand what's actually happening on these landscapes. And as a result, all that additional funding and from travel and tourism that's coming in can really meaningfully support not only the farms that people are visiting, but the surrounding farms as well. And so that's, to me, it's the simple act of visiting a farm, I think, can have this massive impact.
Oh, that's beautiful. That truly. I'd hate to skip over an interesting part for me, which is the real estate part. Oftentimes it sounds like the model that you've promulgated is not real estate ownership, but you've got to put a lot of capital into getting this off the ground. How does that work? I mean, are you looking at ownership, or are you having to do ground leases and raise outside capital to put it together? And I'm sure they have questions around, you don't own the land. Like what does the real estate piece look like for this venture?
Yeah. Well, something that folks may not know about unless they're in the hospitality industry is how sort of traditional hotel finance and real estate works. And I mention this because there's parts of this that can then be used in how to create more agritourism locations that I think is helpful to understand. And so if you think about like a Marriott doesn't own their hotels, the land, the building, any of that. There's a property owner, a property developer who invested in buying that place or building that place. And then they signed a contract for Marriott to run that location. And that's what's called a management contract or a management agreement. And, because you can imagine that the person who owns the building may not have any idea how to actually run it, whether it's hiring people, payroll, marketing, housekeeping, food and beverage, you name it. So usually there's a property owner who then pays an operator or manager to run it. And then oftentimes that operator or manager will also come with a brand. So, there are unbranded operators. If you own a hotel, you could pay somebody to manage it for you under whatever your brand is. but you can also hire a Marriott, and Marriott says, okay, well, then it's going to be under our brand. So that's additional value that we bring because now people know it's a Marriott, more people will come. And so when you take that model and you apply it to this space, a lot of interesting things happen because it turns out there's a lot of people already who are buying or building locations where the whole idea is to center the farm right in the middle of it. And so they have a sustainable farm. They might also have a hospitality component where they want, there to be a lodge or an inn or guest rooms or cabins. Oftentimes they'll also put in some housing and this idea of an agri-hood where people could own homes on a property that also has a farm. And in that case, Sagra basically gets a management contract. It's signed on to manage all of the guest-facing elements. And so, yes, Sagra doesn't own the real estate. We're an operator. There's somebody else who owns the real estate. We can partner with a range of different property owners. And it's a really clean structure that is not only well understood in the industry, but it also works really well in this domain because, as you know, just through the people on this podcast, there's a lot of people who are putting time and effort and money into creating locations that have all these aspects that we're talking about. But what's missing is who's going to actually run it. And a traditional hospitality business that doesn't have any background or roots in agriculture may not do it justice for how to really care about the farmers, support the farmers, connect guests to the farm. And that's our whole area of focus is that, yes, we're a hospitality business, but the only reason we even exist is to connect people to farms and support farmers.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks for that rundown. Well, David, this has been an inspiring and enlightening interview and just a pleasure to connect with you. It's really fun to see this journey. And you're at the initial stages. You incorporated when in 2019, is that right?
Yeah, right at the end of 2019.
So it's all coming together now. How can people reach out to you or to Sagra? Let's say if they either want to stay on a farm or join a meal for a great meal, or even if they have a farm and they're interested in pursuing a relationship with you.
Yeah, there's a number of great ways people can do that. One is if people visit our website, which is sagrafarms.com, SAGRA farms.com. You can find information on our current locations. You can easily just book a stay on a farm. You can book meals on a farm through our website. And that's the whole idea is we want to make it dead simple for you to be able to visit these places. And that's how you do it. And if you're somebody who owns a property, is building a property, is buying a property where you would love experiences like this to happen that deeply connect people to farming, and we would love to hear from you and figure out how we can support in that way. On our website, there is a partnerships page right at the top. And people can just put in their information and say, hey, I'd love to talk with you. And that's a great way to do it. And also, I always love just connecting people, with people directly. And so my email is easy. It's david@sagrafarms.com. I love hearing any, projects that people are working on and even how we can help support just other people in their own efforts that are aligned around connecting people with farms. So any of those are great ways to reach out.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I just looked at my notes and I would love to ask one more question to end this conversation, which is, what is the meaning of Sagra? Or is there?
There is a meaning. So if I go back to the beginning of our conversation and how I mentioned that my family growing up ran an agrotourism in Italy, a farm where people can stay and visit, Sagra is an Italian word that doesn't honestly have a direct translation into English, but the closest thing you could sort of get to it is a celebration of food and community. So for example, there's thousands of sagras, these celebrations every year in Italy. And like the Sagra della Cipolla is basically a celebration around the onion harvest. So when the onions are harvested, a community comes together to celebrate the bounty, the harvest. Typically there's a meal. And so it's sort of a harvest festival, community coming together. And so that word ultimately encapsulates everything that we're talking about. It's not just focused on farming and the magic of what can happen in the soil, but it's the whole human aspect of people connecting with those places.
I'm glad I asked that. What a beautiful name to really encapsulate what you're trying to do. So
yeah.
kudos for putting this together. It's really an inspiring journey, and it's just great to see somebody that is really focusing on this end of the industry and preserving farmland and making sure that we can highlight regenerative and sustainable farming practices. So thank you for taking the time, David. And we'll have to have you on in a couple of years to see how Sagra has continued to grow.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for the invite and letting me be on this.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the show today. If you want to follow our work at Latitude, you can follow us on Instagram at latitude.regenerative.re, and mine is at I am Neil Collins. We inherently believe in the potential that comes from connecting value-aligned and purpose-driven people together in community. That's why I encourage you to join our mighty network and introduce yourself to the other people working across the globe to advance a more regenerative, resilient, and beautiful world. Here, we want to know what you're working on and what inspires you. Through this platform, you can attend live events, take courses provided by our podcast guests, and create connection with other people and businesses that share your same passion. To join, find the link in our show notes or visit our website at chooselatitude.com. If you'd like to support the show, please share it with your friends and be sure to follow us on your podcast app so that you always have the latest episode downloaded. Another way to support our regenerative field building is to leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcast. Positive ratings help attract amazing guests, and they can be the deciding factor for someone else to tune in and listen. And who knows? Maybe this is the kind of motivation that it takes for them to finally decide to align their profession with their sustainable and regenerative values and become a positive force for good within their own community. This show was produced by myself and edited by Anthony Wallace and offered as a part of our work with Latitude Regenerative Real Estate.